There are moments in history that feel like a hinge, a single point in time upon which the world pivots, often without warning. These moments are not always grand battles or the coronations of kings. Sometimes they are quiet, cold mornings in an ordinary city, a city that believes itself to be safe, far from the front lines of a global war. A city that is about to learn, in the most brutal way imaginable, that the front lines can be anywhere. Our story begins in December of 1917. The world is tearing itself apart in the Great War, a conflict of unprecedented scale and ferocity. But on the eastern coast of Canada, the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, is thriving. It hasn't been touched directly by the shells and the trenches that are carving up Europe, but the war is the very pulse of the city. Halifax Harbour is one of the most important ports in the British Empire. It is deep, it is ice-free, and it is the main assembly point for the transatlantic convoys carrying soldiers, supplies, and munitions to the war effort. The harbor is a constant, churning hive of activity. Gray warships slice through the cold water, merchant vessels heavy with cargo await their escorts, and the sound of steam whistles and dockworkers' shouts fills the air. The city has swelled with soldiers, sailors, and factory workers. It feels vital, important, and above all, secure. Imagine standing on the shores of that harbor on the morning of December 6, 1917. The air is crisp and still, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. It is unseasonably mild for a Canadian winter. The water of the harbor, a channel known as the Narrows, is as calm as glass. From the waterfront, you can see the two towns that make up the heart of the port, Halifax on one side, Dartmouth on the other. Between them, the daily life of a city at war unfolds. Children are walking to school. People are heading to their jobs in the factories and on the docks. In the north end of Halifax, in a working-class district called Richmond, families are sitting down to breakfast, the routine of a Thursday morning proceeding with absolute normalcy. They can see the ships in the harbor from their windows. It's a familiar, comforting sight. The ships are their livelihood, their connection to the wider world, their contribution to a war they believe is just. They are a symbol of strength. But on this particular morning, two of those ships are on a collision course, not just with each other, but with destiny. And one of them is a floating bomb of unimaginable power, its deadly secret hidden in plain sight. The first vessel is the SS Imo. It was originally named the Runic, a passenger and cargo ship built for the White Star Line, the same company that owned the Titanic. By 1917, it's a Norwegian vessel, sailing under a neutral flag. The Imo is in Halifax for a simple reason: to pick up relief supplies for the Commission for Relief in Belgium, an organization dedicated to feeding the occupied territories of Europe. The Imo is empty. It rides high in the water, making it difficult to steer, like a cork bobbing on the surface. Its captain, Hockenfrom, is impatient. The ship was supposed to have left the day before, but its coal delivery was late. Now, on the morning of the 6th, he is eager to get underway and make for the open sea. The second vessel is the SS Mont Blanc. She is a French cargo ship, a workhorse of the sea. And she is the reason we are telling the story. The Mont Blanc had arrived from New York, carrying a cargo so dangerous that it was forbidden from entering most harbors. It was, quite simply, the sum of all fears for a port city in the age of chemical explosives. Stowed deep in her holds was a cocktail of destruction. The primary ingredient was over 2,300 tons of picric acid. Picric acid, when wet, is relatively stable. But when dry, as it was on the Mont Blanc, it is more powerful and more sensitive to shock than TNT. It was a key component in manufacturing lyddite shells, the high-explosive artillery rounds being used on the Western Front. Alongside the picric acid were 246 tons of benzol, a highly volatile motor fuel, stored in barrels on the deck. Below that, 62 tons of gun cotton, a propellant that burns with ferocious speed. And finally, as if to complete this lethal recipe, 250 tons of TNT, trinitrotoluene, the benchmark high explosive of the era. The total explosive yield of the Mont Blanc's cargo was approximately 2.9 kilotons. To put that into perspective, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima some 28 years later had a yield of about 15 kilotons. The Mont Blanc was carrying nearly a fifth of the power of an atomic weapon packed into the hull of a single, unassuming tramp steamer. This was not just a ship, it was a weapon waiting for a trigger. Under maritime law, a ship carrying such dangerous cargo should have flown a red flag to warn other vessels.
But this was wartime.
The harbor was full of German U-boats lurking offshore. Flying a red flag would have been like painting a target on the Mont Blanc side, inviting a torpedo attack that would have obliterated the ship and the city along with it. So, for security reasons, she flew no warning flag. She slipped into the Halifax harbor approach the evening before, a silent, anonymous vessel carrying a city-killing payload. She was forced to anchor overnight just outside the main harbor because the anti-submarine nets that protected the entrance were closed after dark. Her captain, M. Le Medec, was also anxious to move. His orders were to join a convoy that was forming in the harbor's Bedford Basin and sail for Europe. And so, on that bright, clear morning of December 6th, the stage was set. The empty, high-riding Imo was steaming out of the harbor, eager for the open sea. The laden, lethally packed Mont Blanc was steaming in, eager to join its convoy. They were set to pass each other in the Narrows, a stretch of water less than a kilometer wide. It was a routine maneuver, performed by dozens of ships every day. But a series of small, seemingly insignificant errors in judgment, communication, and protocol were about to compound into a catastrophe of historic proportions. This is a classic element of so many great tragedies, a story not of a single evil act, but of a cascade of human failings. It's a core component of what makes this a true World War I mystery, a puzzle of blame and responsibility that would be debated for decades. The rules of the sea are, in theory, simple. Ships, like cars on a road, are meant to pass each other port to port, or left to left. But the Imo, leaving the harbor, was sailing up the wrong side of the channel, the Dartmouth side, to avoid other traffic. As the Mont Blanc entered the Narrows, its pilot, Francis Mackey, saw the Imo coming towards them in their path. Mackey blew the ship's whistle once, the signal that he intended to pass on the starboard, or right, side, maintaining his position. The Imo blew its whistle twice, signaling its refusal. Captain of the Imo wanted to maintain his own course, insisting the Mont Blanc move aside. Here, in these moments, history holds its breath. A simple decision by either captain to yield would have averted disaster. But pride, stubbornness, or perhaps simple confusion in the heat of the moment took over. More whistle blasts were exchanged, a confusing conversation of steam and sound that only increased the uncertainty. Finally, seeing a collision as inevitable, Mackey on the Mont Blanc ordered the engines hard to port, turning the ship towards the center of the channel. At the same time, Captain on the Imo, in a fatal miscalculation, ordered his own engines into reverse. On a ship with a single, right-hand turning propeller, putting the engine in reverse doesn't just slow the vessel, it kicks the bow sharply to the side, directly into the path of the oncoming French ship. The collision itself was not dramatic. It happened at 8:45 a.m. It was a low-speed impact, a grinding, metallic screech as the Imo's prow, high out of the water, sliced into the Mont Blanc's number 1 hold on the starboard side. For a few seconds, the two ships were locked together. Then, the Imo pulled away, leaving a gash in the Mont Blanc's hull. To the onlookers on the shore, it must have seemed like a minor nautical accident, a fender bender at sea. But the crew of the Mont Blanc knew better. The sparks from the grinding steel had done the unthinkable. They had ignited the benzol fuel stored on the deck. Flames erupted instantly. A thick, oily, black column of smoke began to pour into the clear morning sky. Captain Le Medec knew immediately that his ship was lost and that a far greater danger was imminent. There was no firefighting equipment on board that could possibly contain a fire of this magnitude, a fire that was burning directly above holds packed with thousands of tons of high explosives. He gave the only order he could: abandon ship. The French sailors, screaming warnings in French that few on the shore could understand, scrambled into the lifeboats and rowed frantically for the Dartmouth side, away from their burning, floating time bomb. The ship, now a ghost ship, crewless and on fire, drifted on the current. It floated slowly across the Narrows, coming to rest against Pier 6 on the Halifax side, right at the foot of the busy Richmond district. And the city watched. The spectacle was mesmerizing. A ship burning in the harbor was a dramatic event. People stopped what they were doing. They gathered at their windows, on the streets, and on the waterfront to get a better view. Children on their way to school paused to point at the pillar of black smoke. Office workers in the downtown core crowded onto the upper floors of their buildings. They had no idea what they were witnessing. They saw a fire, not a fuse. They didn't hear the warnings of the French sailors. They only saw the terrible beauty of the flames against the blue sky. But some people did understand the danger. In the railway yard near Pier 6, a dispatcher named Vince Coleman was at his telegraph key. He and his colleague, William Lovett, learned from a sailor about the Mont Blanc's cargo. They knew what was about to happen. Lovett ran, but Coleman remembered that an inbound passenger train, the number 10, from St. John, New Brunswick, was due to arrive at the station at any minute. It was carrying hundreds of people. Coleman had a choice. He could run, save his own life.
Or he could stay.
He went back to his telegraph key. His last message, tapped out in frantic Morse code, was a final act of selfless heroism. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor, making for Pier 6, and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. The message was heard. The train was stopped. Vince Coleman saved the lives of some 300 people. He never left his post. For 19 minutes, the Mont Blanc burned. 19 minutes, as the city of Halifax gathered to watch its own execution. The fire burned through the deck, heating the explosives in the holds below. The pressure built. The picric acid and TNT reached their critical point. At 9:04 and 35 seconds a.m., the world ended. The Mont Blanc did not just explode. It ceased to exist. In a fraction of a second, the ship and everything in its immediate vicinity was vaporized in a flash of white light, a man-made sun born in the heart of the harbor. The temperature at the center of the blast reached an estimated 5,000 degrees Celsius. The explosion created a pressure wave that moved at a speed of more than 1,000 meters per second, faster than the speed of sound. This wave was not like wind.
It was a solid thing.
It was a wall of compressed air that hit Halifax with the force of a physical blow. Buildings did not just collapse, they were pulverized. They turned to dust and splinters in an instant. Heavy iron cannons were tossed through the air like toys. The steel hull of the Mont Blanc was ripped into thousands of pieces of shrapnel, some weighing hundreds of pounds, which rained down on the city for miles around. The ship's main anchor, weighing over half a ton, was found 2 miles away. A single gun barrel landed in Dartmouth, more than 3 miles away. The entire district of Richmond, the residential area closest to Pier 6, was wiped from the face of the earth. In an area covering more than 325 acres, not a single structure was left standing. It was a scene of absolute, biblical devastation. It was, and still is, the largest non-nuclear explosion ever created by humankind. The Halifax explosion had instantly become a grim new benchmark in the history of destructive power. Seconds after the silent, annihilating pressure wave, the sound arrived. A deafening, earth-shattering roar that was heard hundreds of miles away. And then came the secondary effects, each one a disaster in its own right. The blast created a vacuum over the harbor. The water was sucked away, exposing the seabed for a moment. Then it rushed back in, forming a massive tsunami, a wave as high as 60 feet. It crashed into the shattered shoreline, sweeping away the ruins and dragging people back into the harbor. It slammed into the Dartmouth side, destroying the Mi'kmaq First Nations community that had lived there for generations. And then there was the glass. Every window in a 50-mile radius was shattered. For those who had gathered at their windows to watch the fire, it was a death sentence. The glass became a blizzard of tiny, deadly projectiles, flying at supersonic speeds. This single factor would have a profound and lasting impact on the city's survivors. For those who survived the initial blast, they emerged into a new world. A world of gray dust, black smoke, and an eerie, unnatural silence. Then the silence was broken by the sound of collapsing buildings, and then the screams. People were trapped in wreckage, horribly injured, blinded. The living began the desperate search for the dead. The scale of the carnage was impossible to comprehend. Nearly 2,000 people were killed in an instant. Another 9,000 were injured, many of them severely. Over 25,000 people were left homeless, their houses simply gone, just as winter was beginning to set in. To make matters worse, a severe blizzard hit the city the very next day, dumping over a foot of snow on the ruins, hampering rescue efforts and adding to the misery of the survivors. The story of the Halifax explosion does not end with the blast. In many ways, that's where the most compelling part of the story begins. It becomes a story of survival, of heroism, and of a city's refusal to die. It also becomes a story of scientific discovery, because this unprecedented disaster became an unprecedented, if tragic, laboratory. The immediate aftermath was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The uninjured survivors, many of whom had lost their own homes and families, immediately began digging through the rubble, pulling out the trapped and the wounded. The city's remaining hospitals were overwhelmed in minutes. Makeshift aid stations and morgues were set up in any building left standing: churches, schools, public halls. Doctors and nurses worked for days without rest, performing surgeries on kitchen tables with dwindling supplies. Word of the disaster, thanks in part to Vince Coleman's final message, spread quickly. The relief effort was immediate and immense. Trains loaded with doctors, nurses, and medical supplies began pouring in from across the maritime provinces and New England. The most significant aid came from Boston, Massachusetts. The governor of Massachusetts organized a relief train within hours of hearing the news. It traveled through the blizzard to arrive in the stricken city, bringing with it a complete medical unit. This act of compassion forged a bond between the two cities that endures to this day. But beyond the human drama, the explosion had other, longer-lasting consequences that would ripple out into the worlds of science, medicine, and law. It was a piece of Canadian history that forced the world to learn some very hard lessons. Firstly, the explosion provided scientists with their first real-world data on the effects of a large-scale air blast. In the rubble of Halifax, physicists and engineers could study the patterns of destruction. They could see how the pressure wave had traveled, how it had reflected off hills, how different types of buildings had withstood or failed to withstand its force. They documented the strange phenomena, the way the blast seemed to jump over certain areas, leaving them relatively untouched, while obliterating the areas around them. This grim research provided the foundational knowledge for civil defense planning in the decades to come. Chillingly, the data from Halifax was consulted by the scientists of the Manhattan Project as they tried to predict the destructive potential of their new atomic weapons. The mushroom cloud that rose over Halifax in 1917 was a terrible prophecy of the clouds that would rise over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The largest non-nuclear explosion in history served as the textbook for the nuclear age. Secondly, the disaster spurred massive advancements in medicine, particularly in the treatment of eye injuries. Because so many people had been watching the fire from their windows, there was an epidemic of blindness and serious eye trauma. Hundreds of people lost their sight. The sheer number of these cases forced doctors to develop new surgical techniques and new methods for treating eye injuries on a mass scale. The crisis gave birth to the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, or the CNIB, in 1918. It was founded specifically to help care for the hundreds blinded by the blast, and it grew into a national organization that has helped countless Canadians with vision loss ever since. Out of a moment of blinding light came a new focus on sight and healing. And thirdly, the explosion led to sweeping changes in maritime law and harbor regulations. The public inquiry that followed was a long and contentious affair. Blame was shifted between the captains, the pilots, and the harbor authorities. Ultimately, It was a tragedy born of shared negligence in a time of war. But the result was a complete overhaul of how dangerous goods were handled in ports around the world. Stricter rules for storage, transportation, and communication were put in place, all designed to ensure that a disaster like the Halifax explosion would never happen again. The city of Halifax was rebuilt, but the memory of December 6, 1917, is woven into its very fabric. It is a memory of loss, but also of gratitude. Every year since 1971, the province of Nova Scotia has sent a large Christmas tree to the city of Boston. It is a thank you for the aid that was sent in their darkest hour. The tree is lit on the Boston Common, and it stands as a symbol of an enduring friendship, a light that emerged from the deepest darkness. When we look back at an event like this, it's easy to see it as a relic, a piece of forgotten history from a distant war. But the story of the Halifax explosion is more than just a historical account. It's a profound and cautionary tale. It's a story about how our modern world, with all its power and technology, is often balanced on a knife's edge of human error. It's a reminder that the systems we rely on for our safety are only as strong as the people who operate them. It's a testament to the fact that in the face of unimaginable horror, the first and most powerful instinct of ordinary people is often extraordinary heroism. The echoes of that December morning can still be found today, not just in the history books, but in the medical practices that save our sight, in the safety regulations that protect our cities, and in the scientific understanding of forces that can both build and destroy our world. It was a day when a quiet, peaceful city was transformed into a war zone, not by an enemy attack, but by a fatal confluence of circumstance and a tragic failure of communication. It serves as a stark reminder that some of history's most devastating moments come not with the roar of a battle, but with the quiet, deadly drift of a ship on fire. Thank you for listening. What other moments of forgotten history do you think have had a profound, yet unacknowledged, impact on the world we live in today? Let us know in the comments below. We read every one. If you found this deep dive into the past compelling, please consider subscribing and sharing this story. We have many more journeys to take into the forgotten corners of history, the unsolved mysteries, and the strange phenomena that remind us how much we still have to learn about our own world. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these incredible stories. Until next time, sleep well.